And Pac says when you see a rose growing in the concrete, you don't question its damaged petals. Of course it has damaged petals. It's growing in the concrete. Instead, you celebrate its tenacity and its will to reach the sun.
I sit here this afternoon a proud transgender woman, an African-American transgender woman from a working class background, raised by a single mother. I sit here an artist and an actress, a sister and a daughter, and I believe it's important to name the various intersecting components of my multiple identities because I'm not just one thing.
First fight I've ever been into, and I ended up getting suspended for 5 days. No matter who starts it, who finished it, whatever, you get suspended for 5 days. So I was out of school for 5 days, and you know, I missed a lot of work. I had to come back. I was behind in a lot of my classes, and I didn't really learn anything. I had to stay at home. They didn't try to mediate, try to figure out what was going on, who did what. The whole point of being in school is to learn. If you're out of school for 5 days, you're not learning anything.
The school-to-prison pipeline involves the policies and practices that funnel our marginalized students out of classrooms and into the criminal justice system. There are many different routes of the school-to-prison pipeline, and when you look at how each of these routes interrelate and connect to each other, it's especially easy to see how our education system creates a school pushout that turns into a problem of mass criminalization. One of the pipeline routes we've discussed is the achievement gap, which shows us a consistent disparity between test scores and academic achievement among students of color and their white peers. The achievement gap can be explained in part by the critical race theory, in which Letson Billings highlights how the curriculum, assessment, and instruction styles in our education system benefit white students far more than they do minority students. A major tenet of the critical race theory discusses how racism has become normal and natural in American society, which is highlighted in Gregory, Nygreen, and Moran's article on the normalization of failure. This article not only notes how trends in minority students' academic failure have become expected, it also ties in nicely with how there is a prevalent racialized discipline pattern. This brings me to a brief discussion of the discipline gap, which shows us an overrepresentation of minority students in rates of school suspensions and expulsions, despite there being evidence against them actually having higher rates of misbehavior, as displayed by Gregory, Skiba, and Nogueira's article. This article also demonstrates how these rates are actually due in part to differential processing and differential selection. Lawson and Skiba also highlight these disproportional rates and show how suspensions have long-term repercussions for the future. The racialized exclusionary discipline strategies are prominent contributors of the path to the school-to-prison pipeline. Along with the overrepresentation of minority students when it comes to the discipline gap, there is also an overrepresentation of minority students in disability groups in special education. Reed and Knight highlight the individualistic, deficit-oriented perspective taken on disability. This creates even more segregation in schools and education, not only racially, but academically as well, as these students are taken away from mainstream classroom settings and put into programs that push them further away from the education they need and deserve. This in turn strengthens the achievement gap. As you can start to see, the mixture of these routes to the pipeline is apparent in all situations. As I've mentioned before, there are a lot of components of each route that directly tie into each other, such as how the discipline gap exploits minority students with suspensions that force them to miss out on education, which in turn reinforces the achievement gap, because these students don't get a chance to learn and keep up with their white counterparts, who also happen to be benefiting from the curriculum and school structure as it is anyways. In all of these aforementioned routes, blame has been normalized and placed on an individual basis. These minority students are treated in ways that are detrimental to their education and causes a school pushout that leaves them with few opportunities for the future. The policies and practices that create the school-to-prison pipeline indeed work to criminalize bodies, to criminalize students of color to make room for those students whom the education system values, students who are white. This criminal identity that our education system associates with students of color creates and exacerbates a nationwide mass criminalization problem. Before this class, I had almost no understanding of the school-to-prison pipeline. While I had my frustrations with the education system based on what I've seen and learned in a narrow environment, this class and the varying discussions we've had has definitely helped to broaden my view and strengthen my understanding of the underpinnings of not only the American education system, but American society as a whole. The sources and student discussions have honestly opened my eyes to the ways I see these problems in daily life, and they've allowed me to feel more connected as a scholar and even a citizen in American society. All of the statistics and studies and evidence that have been demonstrated by a multitude of authors like Ladson Billings, Skiba, Gregory, and more have helped to solidify my understanding of the school-to-prison pipeline and all of the systematic oppressions that are still apparent in American society.